Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to the Posture Project. As always, I'm your host, Justin Archer, aka the Posture Guy, your number one source on pain, posture, and performance. And today I'm reporting live to you from the bottom right hand corner of your screen. Hey there, or hey there. I can never really quite tell where I'm going to be when I do these screencasts and which way I'm waving. But anyway, today we're going to be talking all about tight muscles, what causes them, how to treat them, and probably most importantly is how to properly diagnose them. Because a lot of times I find that when people have tight muscles, really all they do for them is just try to stretch the ever-loving you-know-what out of them. And in most cases, this really does more harm than good. Now, I've talked about tight muscles in the past. I think I did a post, was it back in early October? Yeah, October 3rd here, a segment inside of the Q&A with the Posture Guy, in which I talked about how to determine if your tight muscles are short and tight or long and taut. I also did a couple videos, and if you're not sure what videos are, they're short 30-second or less videos. I've done several of them here, all of which too I'll link to down below in the post. Ones like muscles don't just tighten up to piss you off. That is a fact. There's always a reason. Are tight muscles weak muscles? Often they are. And stop stretching and start strengthening. So you can check those out at your convenience. But today I wanted to put this talk about tight muscles and everything into context. And I want to talk about tight hip flexors because this is a question that I get very often. And just in the last few weeks, I'd say about a month, whether talking the phone or over email, I've gotten this from 4 or 5 separate occasions from different people. Telling me, Justin, my hip flexors are really tight. My doctor, chiropractor, PT, whoever, is working with them said, my hip flexors tight. What do you recommend? And my first question to them is, okay, well, what hip flexors are tight? And usually if it's in person or over Skype, I usually just get this kind of blank stare and they kind of blink and I'm kind of like, you're there with me? And they're like, well, what do you mean? Like, my hip flexors. And I'm like, okay, I hear you, but which ones? And they usually don't know that there's more than one hip flexor. So usually what I do with them is kind of give them a little bit of an anatomy lesson, and that's what I want to do with you guys as well. So bear with me here. You don't have to memorize all these by any means, but I just want you to have a better understanding, excuse me, of what's going on with your hip flexors. So a lot of times when people refer to their hip flexors, what they're actually talking about is the psoas major, this muscle right here, all right, which attaches to every vertebrae in your lumbar spine and goes down and attaches to the inside of your femur, your big thigh bone. Quite frankly, my favorite muscle, one of the most important when talking about posture. I really think, well, not I think, I know without this, we as humans would not be able to stand upright. So this is a major one right here. And this is what most people refer to as the hip flexor. Kind of like there's many valleys, but there's only one, the valley. So other ones are the iliacus, the tensor fasciae lata, otherwise known as the TFL. You got all your adductors here, adductor magnus, brevis, longus, gracilis, pectinus. The piriformis is not one. It was just on this graphic, so I crossed out. So that is not a hip flexor. You got the rectus femoris here, the big one on the front of the thigh, the sartorius that wraps around the thigh to the inside of the knee. And then you have the gluteus medius and minimus. And most people think, well, wait, that's the glute, the butt, those are hip extensors, right? And you would be right, but the anterior portion, meaning the front portion of both these muscles, so think about vertically cutting this muscle vertically in half, the front portion is actually assist in hip flexion, okay? So both of those. So these are all hip flexors. And, so when a lot of people say that their hip flexors are tight, don't get me wrong, there are some people who do benefit from stretching their hip flexors, but most of the time when people say that and when I see their posture, they look something like this. Now, this is Fabrice, and he's one of my clients, and he's been kind enough to allow me to share these photos with you. I actually shared his photos back on the Q&A session with the Posture Guy for a different reason, but they're still very good postures because they show he's told me he experiences hip flexor tightness when he's sitting at work, And if you look at his posture and you think, okay, well, what are the hip flexors meant to do? Well, it's in the name. They're meant to flex the hip. But really, all these other ones, besides the psoas major, are meant to flex the leg up to 90 degrees, so basically hip level. The psoas major continues to flex it past 90 degrees, so basically as if you were trying to pull your upper thigh and knee towards your chest. Well, let's look at his posture here, and you see, well, there's no flexion going on whatsoever. He's in total hip extension. His hips are bailed forward. His whole body is kind of bowed. So, his psoas major, this big one right here, right? Which if you think, just kind of imagine looking through his body to his lower back and then here to his thigh, that is long and taut. It's not short and tight. So it may feel like the muscle is tight, but in fact it's pulled to its limits and it's long and taut. And due to that weakness in his psoas major, his other hip flexors, all these other ones we went over, in his thigh, in the side of his glute, in his inner thigh, things like that, are starting to compensate. So he probably does feel some tightness in around the thigh, inner thigh, outer thigh, things like that. And even on the front where his psoas is, but again, it's because it's long and taut and not short and tight. So, and this is what most people who tell me their hip flexors are tight look like. And so I have to show them their pictures and go, well, here's why, because they want to know if I give them an exercise that strengthens their hip flexors. They're going, well, why are we doing this? Because, I've always been told my hip flexors are tight. And I go, well, they're basically stretched to the limit. So they're working just to basically hold on so your body doesn't, crumble. Now, someone who would benefit from stretching out their hip flexors, including their psoas major, is someone like this, who is actually bent forward at the hips. You can see that in their hip area, the angle's starting to close. Remember basic geometry? Ideally we want vertical, straight up 180 degrees. But as that angle starts to close, that's hip flexion. So if you're confused about the terms, hip flexion, think about going into a fetal position. That's kind of the extreme version of hip flexion. And if you want to think of an extension, think about standing up, yawning, and stretching your arms out. That would be an extreme version of hip extension. What you can see, Fabrice here is headed towards that overall extension. From his ankles to his knees to his hips, everything is leaning forward, going forward, and then so he basically doesn't face plant. His upper body translates backwards. So now he's in hip extension. And then so he doesn't fall backwards, his upper body, neck, and head compensate by rounding forward into flexion. So this is kind of, if you ever played the game Jenga, it's like the blocks basically balancing each other out. So in Fabrice's case, and there's a lot of people like this with similar posture, if he actually were to strengthen, and this is actually what I'm working with him on right now, strengthen his psoas major, that's actually going to feed slack to the rest of his system. His other hip flexors will loosen up because now they don't have to compensate for his weak psoas major. But also it's going to pull his hips, his midline end point, basically back here so it sits directly above his knees and ankles and directly under his shoulders. Then as a result of that, this sway back that you see going on here and this kind of kyphosis, this rounding of his upper back and shoulders, which then leads to his head jutting forward, will actually start to correct itself. This kind of C-shaped spine will start to take on back its natural S shape, and his head will move back over his shoulders just by re-engaging and strengthening that psoas major. So again, a lot of times it's really a matter of strengthening instead of stretching. Now, a lot of you may go on, yeah, Justin, okay, I hear you, but I sit for a long period of time, and that's why I'm always in hip flexion, and so my hip flexors are tight. And I totally hear you, but what you're really experiencing is, if you think about it, when you sit down, right, how's gravity acting on you? Well, your butt is against the chair, and it's pushing your thigh bones, the head of your femur, this little guy right here, basically up towards the front end of the socket. And that is actually going to push on the psoas major and make it feel tighter. So basically, hopefully you can see me in a little video here, here's my shirt, and if it's already tight, but now I stick my hand in the middle, I push forward, the shirt actually isn't becoming any tighter, but it's more taut because I push my fist into it. So think of my fist as basically the head of your femur, and when you sit down, it pushes forward. The other part of it is that, yeah, if you're sitting for a long enough time, with the muscles in a shortened position, they're going to get tight. But you're not sitting there doing hip flexor lifts and lifting weights all day if you're sitting at a computer. Or at least I know I don't, and other people don't, right? You're usually just sitting there. So it's not, the muscle isn't becoming short and tight because you're doing activity. Like, for instance, your chest would become short and tight if you were to do 200 push-ups right now. Later, probably right now, later today and tomorrow, you feel pretty sore in there. That's an example of muscles becoming short and tight. This, in Fabrice's case, and a lot of other people who I see would say that they have tight hip flexors, their hip flexors, let's change the language we're using. The hip flexors are not short and tight, they're long and taut. And let's even further specify that. His Psoas Major, right, this guy here, is long and taut. His other muscles, the other hip flexors, are become chronically tight and most likely short as a result of his weak Psoas Major. So strengthen the Psoas Major, and that'll feed slack to the other hip flexors as well as to the rest of his body. So I know that's a lot to go over and a lot to digest, but hopefully that'll help not only Fabrice and some of the other people I talked to the last few weeks about how to determine, if your hip flexors are short and tight or long or taut, which hip flexors are tight, and how to properly treat them. Hopefully that'll help you guys. And I've actually put 4 exercises down below that will actually help strengthen your Psoas Major and, like I said, feed slack to your other hip flexors as well as to the rest of your body. All right, so check those out, and if you have any questions along the way, please leave them in the comment section below, or you can always just call or email me. All right, thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you inside the next video. Until then, take care and keep moving.